Can confirm. Hybrid virtual events are hard. In this video, we're going to go through and review a community unconference event that I ran with James Catell, Jill Nicholson, and a bunch of incredible community managers in the UK. And we're going to talk about some of the failures in addition to the incredible successes that we had. In about October of last year, James Catell, someone who I really look up to in the government online community space, posted on the Rosie Sherry site for a specific unconference that he had run the previous year. Just didn't have time to run it on his own, so he was looking for some volunteers. I had previously just done a playlist collaboration with a whole bunch of community managers to talk about virtual and hybrid event development, so I told myself, hey, I need to put my money where my mouth is. Let's actually apply the learnings from that playlist. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus first on the format of the actual event, and then we're going to focus on the actual talks, the conversation, and the substance that came out of the discussion. We'll focus specifically on the controversial decision that we made to add keynote speeches to the community unconference models, and then we'll dive deeper into the successes of the event and, truth be told, what we could do better when we do this event in September and then again next year. First and foremost, it's really critical that we talk about the nature of the event. This was a community unconference. What is a community unconference? Unlike a traditional conference where they set up the specific talks and the discussions prior to the conference, a community unconference asks people to bring their expertise and on the spot have discussions and conversations. A lot of people have specific topics and problems and issues in their own communities, and they may want to offer that topic and ask, hey, do we have any experts in the space who would like to discuss this topic? So some of the people might actually recommend a topic without actually having an expertise in it, and it allows people to come together in small groups where experts can speak with people struggling with the problem in order to answer that issue at the conference. In other words, we are shedding the concept of a stage where people are expected to tout their expertise in favor of sharing their successes and their failures over time. Specifically on the hybrid aspect, we wanted to make sure that this event, based primarily in the UK and with a primary audience of government communities, was still accessible in two ways. First, we wanted to make sure that we were able to access the United States, the Asian, and the Australian markets. And second, we wanted to make sure that we elevated voices that did not already exist in the space. So we looked specifically for people who were doing the work, but not necessarily taking up the stage, and also complete newcomers in the online community. If you want to be a giant, find someone else to stand on your shoulders. In order for us to sponsor that, we experimented a little bit with a platform that I've never used, and I received a special sponsorship from Shindig. Shindig is a virtual platform system that allows for way more communication because audience members are allowed to communicate with one another, talk amongst each other, and talk over a large majority of the webinars. And we'll get a little bit more into Shindig because I think it's an incredible platform, but there were a few quirks that made this very new and very burgeoning platform a little bit difficult for us to navigate. We also want to mention that community unconference models tend not to have keynote speakers. In fact, we try to remove that stage in order to grease the wheels and create more networking opportunity. But for this particular event, especially because it was a hybrid virtual event, we did make sure that we included two keynote speakers. One that championed the idea of someone who was doing the work but had less of a lens, and one that is someone who is new and up and coming in the space. Let's now talk about their talks. The first person that we received was Valentina Ruffoni. Valentina Ruffoni runs Disciple. She's definitely one of those people who loves looking elsewhere to expertise and then actually building and implementing off of the strategy and the concepts that other people talk about. The theme of the Community Unconference was successes and failures and being able to bring those failures into the space so that other people can avoid those self-same hurdles. Valentina spoke primarily primarily about a success that she struggles with on the daily: consistency. She talks specifically about building ritual event and ritual content with your community. It's not necessarily you as the community manager who needs to be consistent. It's about the community's plan and making sure that community members are taken care of, even when individual people within that community just simply can't manage the consistency factor. And to do that, she suggested a model. I love models. Of course, I love models, called the 7 Ps of community. This is provided by CMX, and the 7 Ps of community are essentially used to create moderation and facilitation plans that the entire community can get involved in. It first starts with clearly defining a shared concept of the community's purpose. Once we have that, we ask who in the community is best oriented to solve this problem. And they don't just stop at 1 person, 2 people, or 3 people. You're looking for 10 people to place them together in order to own that concept. Once you've got that, you need to make sure that there is a place for that work. This place needs to be rather compelling. That means having task-oriented content and relationship-oriented content. Task-oriented content is exactly what you think it is: meeting together in this space to accomplish a specific set of tasks. But more importantly is the grapevine communication, the interpersonal relationships that keep this social glue running. And that's where participation comes into place. You need to make sure that those members have a role and have a play, have authority necessary for them to keep it all running. And in order for you to do that, you need policy. And lastly, for every goal and every plan and every concept in the community, you need a certain modicum of feedback in order for you to say, yeah, this is successful. And that's where performance comes in. One of the biggest things, and this was a gigantic takeaway from all of the members of this community unConference, was this concept of the Rose Bud Thorn. The idea here is that the rose is talking about a positive highlight, not just what you should keep doing, but something along the lines of saying, hey, you did really, really great here. But then there's this concept of a bud, an opportunity for improvement, a place where you can start doing a thing, but that opportunity for improvement is intensely personal. It's for the people who are actually operating. And then once you have that, there's the concept of a thorn. Now, in this video about imposter syndrome that I did earlier, I talk at length about how important critical negative feedback actually is, making sure that that thorn is a part of the conversation, and finding a place for constructive criticism is one of the best possible things that you can do so that people don't lose heart. Ideas are not just purely positive. You can grow and develop because every rose grows thorns for a reason. Moving on from Valentina's talk, I want to talk about our next keynote speaker before we move into general findings from the community unConference, which tend to be slightly more vague and harder to cover. Maryblessing comes from She Code Africa, but she's comparatively new in the online community space. That does not mean, however, that you can't learn anything from her, because her capacity in open source management and her understanding of A/B testing and experimentation has transferred into community in a phenomenal way. She focuses primarily on having a certain amount of tenacity when it comes to experiments. Right here on this channel, I'm going to be publishing Maryblessing Okolie's entire keynote speech for you. It's already out right now. So this week you get a double feature of videos. But what's most important about experimenting in order to innovate in your online community is perseverance. It's okay if the hypotheses that you did just don't line up with the data that came in. It's okay for an experiment to fail, because it's that failed experiment, it's those mistakes that you make that give you the right questions to ask and allow you to go to your community in order to better understand concepts. Now, with the description of the keynotes over, I would like to turn toward a somewhat more vague, but also really, really important set, which is the actual conversations themselves. As with virtually every conference I attend at CMX, All Things Open, and other areas, we also produced a certain set of shared notes. And we wrote these shared notes explicitly so that you could get benefit from this conference just as much as we have by writing down that conversations. After the video, you can see it in the comments and also in the description. One of the biggest conversations that we had was on the fact that vulnerability is becoming a buzzword. And this slide from a corporate expectation of vulnerability into to a personal expectation of vulnerability can actually damage a large majority of the communities. It's not enough to know the community manager. It's also really important to explain the community manager's power within the concept of the organization. And it's super critical that we also have the ownership of the organization when people fail. In order to resolve this problem, one of the big questions was about ritual content and daily questions. We can't just ask questions in our online community in order to proc engagement. That engagement needs to actually come from the organizations themselves. A part of this vulnerability and this authenticity is recognizing that the questions we use to stoke engagement in our communities apply to us as community managers and key stakeholders just as much as they do community people. One of the best quotes that I received at this conference hit me super, super hard. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. This is about recognizing that we are building a culture. Taking part in that culture requires that we understand the community's practices, experiences, and expectations. It's our job to conform and be community members first, not for us to strong arm the precedents and the momentum that we set in community. Wrapping that up is this fifth concept, which is absolutely phenomenal. Engagement is not what we're going for. What we're going for is involvement. I would really love to credit the person who came up with this, but in an unconference, it's so difficult for me to do so. But this is such a good analogy. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're inviting people with us on a journey, and we're in the driver's seat. The idea of engagement is to bring in passengers and have a wonderful conversation in the car. But ultimately, what we're really looking to do is put them in the driver's seat. We become passengers for a community goal. It just so happens that as passengers, our brand or our organization or the key stakeholders in our project are benefiting from that community driving success and moving further and further toward a shared concept and goal. So now we're going to spend the last leg of this video actually walking our talk. I'm going to process through Valentina's Rose Bud Thorn process in order to talk about what we really could have done better, because let's be honest, we did not do well about the virtual hybrid inclusion, which kind of hurts because I did put this playlist together. First off, let's start with the roses, the things that we think we did well. I want to discuss the really controversial choice that we made to include keynote speakers. This was a really, really good move because the keynote speakers were explicitly intended not to be at the actual event. It really encouraged the people who were on the ground in London to pay attention to the virtual participants. I also think that for virtual participants, there is a much higher hurdle to getting them to come and arrive at a specific time that is not necessarily as agreeable as it is for physical presence. In physical space, there's an energy and a networking to people's presence that you really have to work a lot harder to achieve in virtual space. And even though people may have left after the keynotes, it provided a really great impetus and reason for people to come. That leads us to the bud, things that we want to do in the future. I think by and large, one of the issues that we had was that the virtual component was projected onto a wall, and we had two owl systems, basically 360 cameras that allowed for virtual components to see the vast majority of the in-person. But the big issue is when it comes to an unconference, people are walking around, they're running around, and the audio was so ridiculously muddled.
I don't even know what to look at.
So for periods of up to 45 minutes throughout the course of the unconference, the virtual teams really had nothing to contribute. They could provide topics on the Miro board and we could discuss and talk amongst each other. But by and large, there was no real reason for people to participate. And as a result, I think that the best thing we could have done was forego the owls and the complexities of the technical space altogether and just have a laptop running the virtual space at every table. This is super simple to the empty chair, which is this concept of making sure that people outside of the room are represented. If we provided a chair specifically for a public laptop, we could make it a lot easier by having a breakout room set for people to visit individual tables and understand individual concepts. As it stood with the way that we operated it, we were kind of locked in to either joining a general concept in the room or creating our own groups within Shindig. And I have to say, Shindig did not do well in that department. Which brings us into the thorns. I think ultimately Shindig is not quite at the level that we need in order to perform an unconference format, because it didn't have the ability for us to manually move people into breakout rooms. As a facilitator, I didn't have the ability to get people connected. One particular issue that we ran into was the fact that I can't kick people out of groups either. That resulted in someone who had to take a call and forgot to mute themselves, forcing me to completely realign all of the groups and kick that person by virtue of a very complicated process, forcing them to disconnect. The only option that I had was that I had to outright ban them. Ultimately, I do want to thank Shindig as a sponsor for this event, because despite a lot of the thorns, they were actually really incredible and quite amenable to our operation in the space. I also want to mention our attendance factor. We had 100 tickets show up, and unfortunately, we really didn't have that same amount of people show up for the actual event. So we really should have spent a lot more time getting people hyped and focusing on making sure that those individuals who received feedback actually received feedback. As a Bud, I do think that one thing we could have done a lot better was make sure that the event was easy for virtual attendees to actually attend. The event was based in London, and we ran into a problem because Maryblessing was in Africa, I was in the United States, so I was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning in order to attend the event. And dealing with time zones is always really difficult, but it may have made a lot more sense for us to do a session in the morning, wait 4 hours, and then do a session in the evening. By having two completely separate setups with a networking period in the middle, it may have made a lot more sense for virtual components, even though it definitely makes the physical portion of the event a lot more difficult. All I can say is thank you so much to Valentina and Maryblessing, especially Maryblessing. You gave an incredible talk, and I look so forward to seeing what's going to happen with the future of your career, because truth be told, you're already doing incredible things at She Code Africa. I also want to say a special thank you to James Catell, who ran last year's event and also truthfully founded the Community Managers unConference. Jill did an incredible job helping us coordinate with support, features, making sure that volunteers were set up. You did phenomenally, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention our absolutely wonderful sponsors. Especially Shindig for providing the platform for free, Common Room and Threado for being so willing to make sure that we managed to fund this event in and of itself, and also Francisco at Led by Community for making sure that the community facilitation and moderation found itself into a newsletter and content after the fact. Thank you so much, and remember that the unConference is happening again next year, and we're also going to be running a smaller event. We're shooting for September, maybe August or October, in order to make sure that we can test and build and iteratively learn what it means for us to build these virtual frameworks. And then next year, we're going to nail that hybrid model. We're gonna nail it.